morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Borja, and I run an early-stage VC firm focused on climate tech investing at a global level. And I'm really, really excited to be here today alongside this group of amazing climate investors to talk a little bit about the current state of climate and the future state of climate. Before we get into the substance, I'll quickly introduce the subject at hand. So as I'm sure you're all aware, climate change is one of the biggest threats of our time, and we believe that technology is the fastest and most scalable solution to tackle it. In terms of what climate tech is, it's basically any technology that contributes to reduce CO2 emissions and capture CO2 from the atmosphere. We believe that we are experiencing the most interesting times of climate tech. If you think about it, there's really tailwinds coming from every angle. On the regulation side, we have the US that approved the IRA with $370 billion invested into climate finance. In Europe, we have the Green Deal approved recently, which I think is $578 billion. The UK is following suit with a similar structure. And on top of that, we have the corporate world, which is also on board. 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies have already committed to climate change pledges. And most importantly, there's been fundamental technology advancements over the last decade that are really catalyzing the ecosystem. The best example of which is how the prices of energy solar have decreased by 90% over the last 10 years. So that really catalyzes the ecosystem and prepares it for an outstanding growth. Now, before I transition over to our panelists, just to let you know that we are running on a very short schedule, so I might have to interrupt you guys. I apologize in advance. Don't take it personal. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nityen, who will start covering what are the hottest trends in climate tech.
So good afternoon. Nityen Lal, ICOS Capital. So we're looking at industry decarbonization, which accounts for about 40% of total CO2 emissions. And we're looking at technologies in food areas, chemical areas, carbon capture. Some of the interesting stuff that we look at is technology called industry biotech or precision fermentation, which effectively should replace the process of production by fossil fuel-based technologies into bio-based technologies and use circular feedstock. That is one of the areas we are quite excited about. We start to see companies becoming more commercial, and this is one of the areas we're investing in.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing. Brian?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Brian Walsh. I'm head of Wind Ventures. And I'll start this out with sort of a comment on space, markets, and then tech. On the space, the climate tech tee-up is a quantified problem that is time-bound. And so this is very unique for this space versus other tech sectors. And so every day that goes by, because of how it's framed up, the sense of urgency increases. And I think we'll see some interesting behavior because of that. One example is climate tech VC has performed relatively well compared to the general VC market in general the past few years. When it comes to market, there's developed and there's developing. And we cannot forget about the developing world. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. One is developing the best tech, and the other is deploying it. Or at least that's what can happen. And that's a little backwards introduction to Wind Ventures. This is what our arching thesis is. We out there sourcing the world's best tech and bridging to Latin America. And it's working very, very well. On the tech side, I think the bigger problems are the hard-to-abate sectors. So that's heavy industry, that's aviation, that's mining. A lot of these guys have a lot of different pathways to decarbonize, and it's very difficult to figure out which one works the best. And so it's a really interesting problem to solve, very difficult. So that's where I think a lot of the best minds are gravitating towards. The other realization I see that's creating a hot trend is we've got these goals in 2030 and 2050 to save the world. but there's a realization that we're probably not going to make it with the energy transition as is defined. And so there's a growing realization we're going to have to do carbon capture and get that cost down, because there will be geographies and sectors that just will not be able to meet the goal. And so from a VC perspective, this is something that I think is going to play a bigger role. Lastly, I'll say, because we just had a panel here in this room about AGI, so generalized artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, and if think about that for a while, of what the connection is to energy. But it's no longer compute constrained. It is 100% energy constrained. In fact, Amazon just purchased a nuclear reactor to co-locate their new data center. And so as these data centers say, I need baseload clean energy, the intermittency of renewables simply doesn't cut it. And so we're going to see, in fact, I'm already seeing it where I'm from, which is Silicon Valley, a resurgence in SMR, or small nuclear reactors. And you might think about that for a while and say, okay, that's interesting for AGI. But in fact, if you think about it, it could play a really interesting role in helping to meet climate change goals in 2030 and 2050. So quite an exciting trend there.
Thanks, Brian. Melina?
Yeah, so on climate trends, I'll divide it into thematic and funding-wise. So on the thematic side, one of the areas that we are most excited about adding new, by the way, we're a climate tech VC based out of Germany, but investing in Europe and the US at the early stage. So one of the areas is regenerative agriculture. It's one of the hot topics, I would say, right now in food and ag, and for good reasons. As an example, the price of cocoa right now has spiked dramatically over the last 6 months, from 3K historically to over 10K per ton. And the simple reason is that the agriculture that has been practiced in a lot of developing countries to produce cocoa is not sustainable in the long term. And therefore, something has to change. And the solution, or one of the solutions, is more regenerative practices in agriculture. In Europe, we have invested in a company called Agrina, which is the largest platform for regenerative agriculture, helping farmers switch from traditional to regen ag. And the business model is around soil carbon credits, but also facilitating the transition through working capital. And regenerative agriculture right now is one of the main topics, not just in Europe, but also in the US, across the world. So that's one of the thematic things within climate that we find super exciting at the moment. The other one is energy in industrial applications more generally. So we were talking about hard-to-abate sectors. Industry is obviously at the core. And helping these industrial players decarbonize starts with energy, optimizing energy, benefiting from distributed energy resources. And there are many startups tackling this problem from different angles. We invested, for example, in Trava, which is an energy procurement company in Germany, basically trying to become a digital utility for consumer and industrial clients. On top of that, doing energy management systems, so understanding what are the ways where an industrial player can optimize, but then obviously the end goal is to do flexibilization. So really switching on and off different machines or different resources to be able to truly benefit from the renewable energy increase that all these industrial players are tapping onto. So that's the second thematic topic. And then on the funding side, I think a pretty exciting trend is that we have come to the realization, especially on the hardware side, that a lot of climate tech requires a different type of funding and not just venture capital. So where is the first-of-a-kind fund being financed? Where are the infrastructure funds focusing on climate in Europe, for example? And I think there are a few infra funds in Europe that are being on the works right now to really fill that gap, and that will come to market in the next few years. And I think that will be a game changer for financing hardware, specifically in Europe, because most of the players have been in the US so far. And perhaps Breakthrough Energy has some more experience on that as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Borja. Please, and if you need to stop me, just cut me out directly. I get very excited about this topic. So maybe What I will do, so Breakthrough Energy is the foundation started by Bill Gates in 2015, which is focusing on clean tech and reducing emissions as our main KPI, right? So the way we do it, and I will step back, and you were mentioning policy at the beginning, no? It's like we combine, our work in, policy advocacy, we work around the capital, and I will go into deeper what we do at the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund, but as well we focus on technologies, right? I mean, that is the core of the whole conversation, right? So like, as out of the policy conversation, we feel that we are in a momentum where energy policies are connected to industrial policies, and that is a great moment right now to start materializing on some of this manufacturing of the technologies that we will need in the future to reduce emissions. But the way we start working, doing reverse engineering is by, let's see, what are the sectors that will have the emissions or the emissions coming from, right? And we start by these 51 billion tons of CO2. That is the total annual emissions that we emit nowadays. And we dissect into what are the, all the human activities that we realize day by day that have an impact, right? So we pretty much focus on the electricity sector in things that are not mature yet or that are reaching maturity. Things like, what is the long duration energy storage technologies that we need to back up the electrons? What is the new ways of producing the electrons aside of the already mature technologies that we need to deploy at scale and fast, right? But what are the other ways of electrifying? How we use that electrons. Transportation, for example, really focusing on the energy vectors that would be a tipping point for how we can decarbonize aviation, how we decarbonize the maritime sectors, and all the electrofuel-based energy vectors that come from that. Buildings, how we build and how we live and use the buildings nowadays, materials embedded there, heat pumps, and the way that you use or they produce the cement and the steel that we need there, and the agriculture sector for sure. No? Not only how we plant and how we harvest and how we control the land when we plant our food, but as well which is the type of food that we consume, right? And we have innovations in different ways of the stream that we are very enthusiastic to. Maybe if I need to pick a topic now, I'm very bullish on the heat applications. We're just hearing about the energy use worldwide. It's 80% out of it's in the form of heat, right? So we are seeing technologies that are coming to the sphere now, to the commercialization stage, that are able to electrify directly that heat. And what is that important? Because we are able to reduce emissions in a sector that we never had a clear path on how to do that, right? So we are looking at how to use the electrons, to reduce emissions in thermal processes, and not using hydrogen on doing that. But if not, using carbon capture, another element that we were just discussing on doing so. So, the ventures team is a very core team within Breakthrough Energy as a family. So, but we are looking for other valleys of debt as well on how to help these clean technologies to develop. No? So we are seeing that the bigger ticket size, the longer tenure, like the risks implied in here are very burdened, and we need to help on conveying. But as well, what happens when these projects come to the field, to the land, right? And what are the challenges for these first-of-a-kind projects, right? So we have a follow-on program called the Catalyst that, by the way, we are, the head of Catalyst here in Madrid today and is doing a panel right after this one. So if you want to hear more about how to scale up the technologies after the venture phase, we'll be providing more insights there.
Awesome. Thanks, Alberto. I'd love to double-click on what you mentioned about how policies are now being more specialized per industry. What are some examples where you see a lot of potential for impact?
In terms of technologies or in terms of the policy levers?
Yeah.
So, you just mentioned right now, the Green Deal Industrial Plan and, the Net Zero Industrial Act, which is the act that recognizes a list of, key technologies to be manufactured in Europe, at least, covering the 40% by 2030, of the things that we will be using here, as a certain lever to, start focusing on key areas that, in this case, Europe, can have a focus on, or a winning chance. Some of these things is what happened with the thermal storage we were just describing, that will need to be manufactured, and still there is not a clear path on, who will be doing that, right? Or in terms of, I'm, discussing nowadays a lot about the electricity grid now. We need to ramp up investments massively, not only in Europe, but as well in the US, to be able to, inject, all of these electrons that will be coming for the variable renewables, right? What are the other technologies aside of the copper lines that we need to manufacture that can help on making this on a smarter way? Superconductors, dynamic land rating, many other type of solid-state transformers technologies that still, they are not manufactured globally, and there is a chance to do that. So, long story short, the Net Zero Industrial Act and the different opportunities that they will be bringing, I think it's a very good chance of, manufacturing clean tech in Europe.
Very cool. Thanks. Brian, I also wanted to double-click into what you mentioned about AI in the energy field. I mean, I guess everyone's excited by AI. I'd say that right now, the hottest trends within tech are climate and AI. So the intersection of climate and AI, I think, is particularly interesting. What are some of the applications that you've seen within AI in energy that you find particularly interesting?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two distinct opportunities. One is the last one of AI coming in and helping to solve or optimize routing, for example, of the public transportation, especially when you have the added complexities of using fully electric buses, right, that have charge requirements and all the rest. So that has been going on for, I'd say, the last 10 years, probably longer. And I think we can certainly expect that to get better and better as the impact of AI to energy is realized more, but also the AI gets better. I think the new thing that I'm seeing, which is big, is the generalized AI with the ChatGPT. And as someone who's been doing clean tech, climate tech investing for over 20 years, I was in it during the hard times, and now these are sort of the fun times. But we were looking at SMRs, small nuclear reactors, maybe even thermal batteries you would bury into the ground for 30 years. I looked at that 15 years ago. And maybe for island states, could displace the high cost of diesel because you're shipping in the fuel. But now there's a really nice here and now opportunity there. And my point there, and I'll say it again because I do think it's so interesting that as they scale these data centers and build a lot more of them, the compute power doesn't align well with intermittent renewables. It just doesn't, even if you have energy storage there. So they're going to need nuclear reactors to make it clean and more like baseload power. And they're already doing this. The big tech guys are already doing this. You can read about it. But it's now going to drive new pressure, a new pull for the more advanced, cheaper, smaller nuclear reactors, which is what they've been waiting for 20 years. And so that is going to be, I think, exciting. And I see a lot of VCs circling their wagons, if you will. And I'm trying to get deep on it myself, because I think that's a very interesting trend. And if you think further, say, how do we actually decarbonize our power grids? That could play a very meaningful part, right? And I haven't done the full analysis of it. It's just sort of anecdotal and common sense, at least to me at this point. But it could be an interesting factor that hasn't been factored in. I don't think so. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Well, thanks so much for all of you for sharing your ideas and investment thesis. I'm sure a lot of these will materialize into very cool climate tech companies in the medium and long term. Now, before we go, I wanted to highlight that, yes, there's been a lot of momentum in the climate tech space so far, but the truth is we're really lagging behind. I think we've invested globally around $1.5 trillion into climate financing this year, but the actual number to be able to hit the 2030, 2050 goals that Brian was alluding to earlier is actually close to $10 trillion. So we're only at like a fifth of where we should be, which means that if there's any LPs in the room, we need a lot more investment into climate. I hope that message is loud and clear. On that note, please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists.